Hi everyone, welcome to webinar 10 of our Data Exchange webinar series for the Targeted Earlier Intervention Program. In today's webinar, we are going to talk about community score, so measuring outcomes for unidentified groups and communities. As usual, there are three key things today's webinar will cover. So we'll talk about what community score actually is and when to use it and how to use it. I'll go through an overarching process for how to use community score, and I'll also show you some concrete examples so you can see what it looks like in practice. In our previous webinars, I introduced everyone to this document, the Data Exchange Quick Start Guide. So as you all should know by now, we've been slowly working our way through each of the steps in this document, and we're now up to step 10 to measure and report client outcomes. So the previous webinar, webinar 9, was an introduction to score and using score for individual clients. And this webinar, webinar 10, is a follow-on from that where we look specifically at community score. So this is the step in the Quick Start Guide, step 10, measure and report client outcomes. And you can see on the screen all of the useful resources we'll go through. So to start, in our previous webinar, I introduced everyone to the concept of measuring outcomes and what client outcomes actually are. I'm just going to cover it off again now, just in case people haven't watched that previous webinar. So what are client outcomes? Client outcomes are the changes your service hopes to achieve. So these could be changes in your client's knowledge, their attitudes, values, skills, or behaviors. And they could be outcomes for individuals, groups, families, or communities. So in the TEI program, there are 9 high-level outcomes that the entire program is working towards. So you can see on the screen on the right-hand side of the table, we've got things like increased client-reported self-determination, sustained participation in employment, etc., etc. And we have mapped these outcomes to the New South Wales Human Services Outcomes Framework. So you can see there are 7 different domains there that include things like safety, healthy, home, and these are the outcomes that the TEI program as a whole aims to achieve for children, young people, families, and communities in New South Wales. So in your TEI contract, you have identified one of these domains for each of the service types you deliver. So these are the high-level outcomes that every single person here today is contributing to in some way or another. So in our webinar, I'm going to show you how to measure and report these for the work that you do. So measuring client outcomes is very, very important because it can help us understand the effectiveness of our services and if our clients are better off after receiving a service we've delivered. So client outcome data can show us if clients have achieved their goals or if their circumstances have improved. And we can use that information to improve the services we deliver to ensure our clients receive the right service at the right time. We can also use this information to build the local evidence base for what works. So we can evaluate our programs and services and identify activities that achieve the best possible outcomes for our clients. So there is an end game to all of this data collection and reporting. It isn't a compliance exercise just for the sake of it. It's really about making sure we're all making a positive difference in our clients' lives and we're giving them the best possible service to improve their situation. To measure the effectiveness of the TEI program, we are reporting client outcome data in the data exchange. So this means we need to use SCORE to report client outcomes. So SCORE is an outcomes reporting tool used in the data exchange, and it stands for Standard Client/Community Outcomes Reporting. So it allows us to report client and community outcomes and satisfaction. There are 4 different types of outcomes that can be measured through SCORE. In our previous webinar, in webinar 9, I took everybody through the 3 types of SCORE for individual clients. So we talked at length about circumstances, goals, and satisfaction score. In the current webinar, we're going to tackle community score, the 4th one you can see on the screen. So community score enables us to report outcomes for groups or communities, so our unidentified clients in the data exchange. In the TEI program, community score should be used when it's not possible, practical, or even relevant to record scores for individual clients. So, for example, at an information night or session, at a community event, for any sort of one-off occasion of service where you don't expect to see that group of people or that individual person again. And it can also be used for some sector development work. There are 4 community score domains that we can use to measure community outcomes. So the first domain is group/community knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors. So if you were to use this domain, you'd be really interested in measuring if the knowledge, skills, or attitudes of the group you're working with have improved. The second domain is organizational knowledge, skills, and practices. So for this domain, we're really interested in if the knowledge, skills, and practices of TEI-funded organizations have improved, and if those organizations are now better able to respond to the needs of their clients and communities as a result of the work you have done with that organization. The third domain is community infrastructure and networks. So this one, we're interested in if the networks or relationships between TEI-funded organizations have improved, and if those organizations are better able to respond to the needs of their clients and communities as a result. The last one is social cohesion. This is pretty self-explanatory. So is there greater cohesion and social harmony within the group or community as a result of your activity? So you hopefully already picked up on this, but those 2 domains in the middle are really only going to be for sector development work. So it's going to be for when organizations work with other organizations to improve how they respond to community need. So they'll only really be used for community sector planning or community sector coordination. So when you're working with other community organizations. On the slide, you should be able to see 4 examples. Of different activities and the community score domain you might use to record that activity. So the first one we've got is a sector development organization runs workshops with TEI service providers, and the workshops teach staff how to measure outcomes. So the community score domain we've chosen is organizational knowledge, skills, and practices, because the organization is working with other organizations and is trying to upskill them to make sure they can respond to client needs in the best possible way. The second example is a community centre hosts a community event. They aim to increase community connectedness for attendees. And the community score domain for that would be social cohesion, because you're trying to increase connectedness between the community and ensure that the local community is as cohesive as possible. The third domain is a sector development organisation supports coordination and collaboration between other providers. They facilitate and coordinate interagencies and local consultation. So the domain we've chosen for that is community infrastructure and networks. And again, this is because they're working with other funded service providers and they're trying to coordinate the infrastructure and networks between those organisations. And then the fourth example is a community centre hosts cooking classes for young parents. The class aims to increase parents' knowledge about healthy eating. And the score domain we've chosen for that is group/community knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviours. And this is because you're trying to improve the skills or improve the knowledge of a group of people that you're working with. So community score has a 5-point rating scale. So you can see down the left-hand side of the screen, number 1 is no change. Then we have limited change with emerging engagement, limited change with strong engagement, moderate change, and significant change. So when you record a community score in the data exchange, you need to use that 5-point scale to identify where your group sits, if there has been no change or if there has been significant change or something somewhere in between. So there are 2 different methods we can use to collect and report community scores. The first method is when you just want to report one community score for the session. So you can do this for community events, for information nights or forums, and for one-off classes or sessions. The second method is when you record pre and post scores across multiple sessions. So you could do this for a series of workshops, forums, interagency meetings. You should only use method 2 though if you have the same group of people attend the sessions, because you want to see if the outcomes for that group have changed. And you should only also use community score if it's not practical or relevant for you to collect personal information from the people who attend your group as individual clients. So they will be recorded as an unidentified group, even though they might be attending multiple sessions. So I'm going to go through each of these 2 methods now in more detail. I'm going to start with method 1, so just recording one score at the end of a session. And I'll also show you some concrete examples so we can see how it all kind of comes together. So there are 3 steps that you need to follow. The first one is to identify the community score domain that you use. So to do this, you need to think about the outcomes you're trying to achieve. You can always look at your contract or your program logic if you have one to help get you started. And then you need to figure out which of the 4 community score domains is most relevant to your outcome. Once you've done that, you can then identify a tool to measure the outcome. So for this method, we have 2 options. We can use score directly as an observation tool. So you can observe the group of people and make a professional judgment about how you think the group is going. Or you can use a survey tool. So you could develop a short survey at the end of the event or the session to give your clients, so you can give the survey to your clients to help you understand how they're going. And then once you've implemented that, you can record the outcome of the survey in the data exchange. So I'm going to take you through an example to show you what this actually looks like. So in our first example, I just want to walk through what might happen for a small community event. So in this example, an organization hosts a barbecue for families in their local community. So they play games where adults and children can mix, and that there's lots of fun things happening on the day. So the first thing they need to do is identify their outcome and the community score domain they're going to use. So the purpose of this event is that it aims to increase community connectedness for the attendees. So the ultimate goal is to increase social cohesion, networks, and participation. So of the 4 community score domains we have, social cohesion is probably the most relevant. So that's what we're going to use to record our outcome. Now they need to figure out how they're going to measure it. So they have 2 options. They can use score as an observation tool, or they can develop a survey. In this example, they decide to use score directly as an observation tool. And the reason they choose to observe the group rather than develop a survey is because this is really just an informal get together. It's just an opportunity for people in their community to connect with each other, to have a fun Saturday afternoon. They don't want to burden people by asking them to complete a survey. And there also might be lots of people coming and going throughout the afternoon. So it could be quite hard to actually get people to answer your questions. So instead of doing the survey, they're just going to watch the group of people, see how people interact and engage with one another. They might have some small conversations with people about how they think things are going. So at the beginning of the event, they notice that people are just engaging in small talk with each other. There's not a lot of engagement going on. But by the end of the event, everyone seems to be mixing well. So people have organized a Facebook group and they've made plans to meet up for coffee and a play date on another day. So we can see that there has actually been some really positive engagement here. So now all they need to do is they just record this in the data exchange. So they're going to use their professional judgment and they need to figure out on that scale of 1 to 5 where they think the group sits. So in this example, they decide that the increased engagement, the fact that people have made a Facebook group, they've got future plans to catch up, that shows a moderate change in the social cohesion domain. So they record this as a 4 on the community score scale. The next example I want to go through is for a large community event. So in this example, a group of TEI service providers organize an event to raise public awareness of mental illness. So the event has stalls for local services. There's a series of talks from community members with lived experience of mental illness. So again, the first thing they need to do is identify their outcome and the score domain. So this event aims to increase community knowledge about services and resources available for people with mental illness and carers. So they decide that the most relevant domain is group/community knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors, because they're trying to impact people's knowledge. They're trying to raise awareness. So now they need to figure out how they're going to measure that. And again, in this example, they decide to use Score directly. And all the service providers at the event and the speakers who presented, they're all going to come together at the end of the day to debrief and talk about how they think it went. So they discuss lots of different things, like how many people came to each stall, what information they were given, how people responded to this information, how many people signed up to receive more information or registered to join a group or an activity, and also how the talks went and if the speakers felt they were successful. So in this example, at the end of the day, all of the service providers come together to have this discussion, and there are lots of different things that they find. Some of the service providers spoke about people who were really grateful for the information that was given to them, and they were really excited about finding out about different services available in their community. But some other services spoke about people who were actually looking for information that they couldn't provide, and they were looking for specific services that weren't even at the event. So there were some mixed experiences. So collectively as a group, they decide that on the community score scale from 1 to 5, that probably indicates that there was limited change, because there were some people who were very happy and others who weren't. So they think they did a bit of an average job. So in the data exchange, they record that as a 3 on the score scale. Before we move on to the next example, there is one little thing that I would like to talk about. So for those organizations who do conduct large scale community events, what I would really like you to start thinking about is how you can record outcomes for these events in more meaningful ways. So with an event like our previous example, I could imagine that there would be local volunteers who contributed to putting on that event. And I could imagine as well that the time spent doing that work could have really empowered them. Maybe after all the planning sessions they were a part of, they really feel like they're contributing to local decision making. Maybe their sense of belonging to the community has improved. And these are all really tangible outcomes that you could measure. The same goes for, in the example I had, the people who spoke at the event. They were all community members with lived experience of mental illness. And again, I could imagine that having an opportunity to address their community and to talk about their lived experience could have a really positive impact on them. And it could have increased their confidence. It could have empowered them. It could make them feel that they have a voice and that they're being listened to by their peers and by their community. So if you started collecting information from volunteers who contributed to your events and people who speak at your events, you'd be able to tell this bigger story about the impact you're having in your community. So what you could do is you could ask those volunteers or those speakers, for example, to complete a client intake form of some sort, and you could create sessions in the data exchange for every time you meet with them to plan the event for the event itself, and you can measure individual outcomes for those clients. So I really encourage everyone to just have a think about how you can start to record these activities in more meaningful ways to show the full breadth of the impact that you're having. So just one last example that I want to show you for our first method, and this is for an organization hosting an information session for new parents. So the first thing they need to do is identify their outcome and their score domain. So the information session aims to inform new parents about support services, activities, and resources that are available in the local community. So of the 4 score domains, they identify that group/community, knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors is the most relevant domain because they're trying to improve people's knowledge. So now they have to figure out how they're going to measure that. So in this example, they decide to conduct a short survey, and they're just going to do that once at the end of the session. So this is for 2 reasons. One, it's not really practical or feasible to collect both pre and post surveys from a large group of people. And also, even if they did collect pre and post surveys, it's highly unlikely that they would see a change in participants' responses, especially for an information session that might only go for an hour. So they develop a short survey that they can just ask everyone to complete at the end of the session. So I'm just going to go to the next slide really quickly. And of course, the slides are stuffing up again. Okay, you should be able to see it now. So this is an example of the survey tool they used. So they hand this to people as they walk in the door and they ask them to complete it at the end of the session. So they just have two simple statements. The session provided me with useful information and I have a better understanding of the services and facilities in my community. So at the end of the info night, they collect these from everyone who's completed them and then they use that to figure out what the community score might be. So now they're up to step 3. So I've got some examples in the third box of how you might figure out that score. So if a majority of respondents said in the survey, yes, the session was useful, I know more about services in my community, then maybe they would record that as a 4, moderate change on the score scale. But if only a small number of respondents said that, then maybe it would be a 2 on the score scale for limited change. So you would just have to look at the results from the survey, tally them up, and figure out where you think the majority sits. And that is it for method 1. So now I'm going to go through method 2. So the second method is to record pre and post scores across multiple sessions. So you could do this for a series of workshops, forums, interagency meetings. You should only use this method though if you have the same group of people attend the sessions. If you have a different group of people attending them, so if you run 3 information sessions and you expect a different group of parents to attend each time, then use method 1. Don't worry about method 2. But if you run a series of workshops and you expect the same group of people to come to every workshop, then you can use this method. So sorry, I've lost where I'm up to. So to implement this method, there are 3 key steps you need to follow. So the first one is to identify your community score domain. So you do the same thing we already discussed. You just need to think about the outcomes you were trying to achieve. Take a look at your contract or your program logic as a starting point if you need to. And then you can try to identify the community score domain that is most relevant to your outcome. Once you've done that, then you can identify how you're going to measure that outcome. So our advice for this method is to use a survey tool. You could do observation if you really wanted to, but I think a survey tool is more appropriate because you're going to be meeting with the group on at least 2 separate occasions. And then again, the last step is just to record the outcome in the data exchange. So the first example I want to take you through is using a survey tool to measure outcomes for interagencies. So in this example, a service provider hosts monthly interagency meetings with local service providers. So the first thing they need to do is identify their outcomes and the relevant score domains. And the purpose of the interagency, as you can see on the slide, is to connect local community organizations with each other, to enable them to share information and to identify emerging issues in the community and to develop solutions to those issues. So of the 4 community score domains, they actually identify 2 domains that are relevant to the interagency. So the first one is organizational knowledge, skills, and practices. And this is because they're trying to increase the knowledge of the organizations about issues in the community, about the best way to respond to those issues, and also about what other organizations are doing in the community. The second domain is community infrastructure and networks. And this is because they're trying to connect local organizations with each other and to facilitate positive relationships between those organizations so they can work together to tackle the issues the local community faces. So they've got their outcome and they've identified the community score domains. Now they have to figure out how they're going to measure that. So in this example, they decide to conduct a short survey. So the first survey is conducted at the beginning of the first interagency at the beginning of the year. And then they decide to do a follow-up every 6 months to see how the group is tracking. So I'm just going to skip to the next slide very quickly. This is an example of the survey they use. So it's quite simple. They have the same questions in both the pre-survey and the follow-up survey because they want to see the difference in everyone's knowledge and their relationships, all that sort of stuff. And then they have 4 relatively simple statements. So I have a strong understanding of my community's needs. I am aware of other organizations in my community who I can work with. I have strong relationships with other organizations in my community, and my relationships with other organizations helps me to respond to my clients' needs. So these statements relate to the community score domains they identified earlier. So you can see in the red box in the bottom right-hand corner, their first 2 statements will be used to measure outcomes for the domain organizational knowledge, skills, and practices. And then the last 2 statements will be used to measure outcomes for the domain community infrastructure and networks. So they'll use people's responses to these questions to determine the community score for those domains. So let me just go back to the previous slide quickly. So they've conducted their survey and they're now ready to record the outcome in the data exchange. So we're up to step 3. So again, I've got some examples on the slide of what this might look like in that last box, but it's really the same as the previous example. You just need to look at all of the results from the survey, tally them up, and then figure out where you think the majority sits on that 5-point scale. And hopefully you'll be able to see that over time, your interagency is supporting organizations to better engage with one another, to share information, and to respond to community needs. So the next example I have is using a survey tool for some sector development workshops. So in this example, a sector development organization hosts a series of workshops with other organizations to learn how to use evidence and data in their work. So they run 3 workshops with the same group of staff members. So as always, the first thing they need to do is identify their outcome and the relevant community score. The workshops aim to improve the staff members' ability to access and use evidence, and also to improve the organization's practices so these skills are embedded in their day-to-day work. So of the 4 community score domains, they identify that organizational knowledge, skills, and practices is most relevant. So they've got their outcome, they've identified their community score domain, and now they need to figure out how they're going to measure that. So in this example, they decide to conduct a short survey, and they're going to do this twice, once at the beginning of the first session and then again at the end of the last session. So I'm just going to skip to the next slide very quickly again, because here's an example of the survey they use. So again, it's super simple. They have the same questions in both surveys because they want to see the difference in clients' responses. And then they just have 2 really clear, simple statements. I use research and data in my day-to-day decision-making, and my organization has embedded evidence-based decision-making in the way we work. So both statements relate directly to the outcomes they're trying to achieve as well. So then they can use the results of the survey to determine the community score. And again, I've got some examples in that 3rd box of what this might look like. So all you need to do is just take a look at all of the results from the surveys, tally them up, and figure out where you think the majority sits on that 5-point scale. So for example, in the first survey, the pre-survey, the majority of staff members might say that they disagree, or they neither disagree that they use research and evidence every day in their everyday decision making. So they might record this as a 2 on the score scale. And then the second survey might show that people are starting to actually use research and evidence. So it might be a 3 or a 4, depending on people's responses. So that's it for the examples I have to show people, but I do just want to reintroduce everyone to this document that I mentioned in the webinar we had last week, so webinar 9. So I introduced you guys to this resource called the TEI Outcomes Matrix. So you can see this is a really simple table that you could use to go through the process that I just went through. So you can document the outcomes you're working towards, how you're going to measure those outcomes, the score domain that you'll use to report the outcome as well. And you can also include information about when it will be measured and who is responsible for measuring it. So this is an example that we completed earlier for the parenting information session. So the first column identifies the outcome domain that we're working in. Then we've got our specific outcome that we're trying to achieve. So we're trying to increase parents' knowledge of services in their community. Then the third column, how will this be measured, includes the survey questions that will be used and the score domain that it will be recorded in. So it just says attendees complete a short survey with 2 questions on a 5-point Likert scale. The session provided me with useful information. I have a better understanding, etc., etc. And then it also says responses are averaged and a single score is entered directly into community score group/community knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors. So we've got the domain there that it's going to be recorded in as well. And then the next column, when will this be measured, gives us information about when the survey will be conducted. So it says at the end of the session, attendees will be given the survey when they enter and will be asked to hand the survey back as they leave the building. And then our last column, who is responsible for measuring the outcome. And it says the leader of the information session will ask attendees to complete the short survey. So you can see we've got a really clear and simple plan of attack for measuring outcomes for the information session. So you can use this resource, the Outcomes Matrix, to help you go through the process that we just went through of identifying your outcome and the score domain and then figuring out how it's going to be measured and implemented. Okay, now we're up to the final bit to actually record community score in the data exchange. So for those of you who are using the web-based portal, there are 3 resources you can see on the slide that walk you through how to enter the community score. So the community score has to be entered at the session level. So after you've created a session, you will have the opportunity to add a community score. Then you just need to select who conducted the assessment. So for community score, we're probably always going to choose score directly. I'm not aware of any validated instruments that measure this kind of stuff, but who knows? And then you can select who conducted the assessment as well. So if the clients completed the survey themselves, if it was done by a practitioner assessment, or if there was a joint process. And then what you can also do is you've got the little matrix that you can see on the screen where you just need to select the outcome domain that was relevant to your activity, and you just select the circle of where the outcome sits on that 5-point scale. It is super important to remember that you do not need to record a score for every domain, just the domain that is most relevant to your activity. So the community score domains are quite disparate from one another, so it's probably going to be very rare that you would ever use all 4 of them. When we think back to the examples I went through today, in almost every one, there was only one relevant domain. It was only the example for interagencies where I used 2. So please think very critically about the work you're doing and the immediate outcomes you're trying to achieve, and try to identify the domains that are most relevant to your activity. You do not need to record an outcome for every domain. Another super important thing to remember is that you should only record community score for sessions with unidentified clients. If all of your clients are individual clients who have a client record in DEX, then you should be using circumstance and goal score to measure their outcomes, not community score. So one of the common questions we always get asked about how many clients is how many clients do you need to report scores for? This is a little bit trickier for community score because, as I just went through, we only use community score for unidentified groups. So as a general rule of thumb, you should record a community score for the majority of your group or community activities where it's not possible to record score for individual clients. So this means for every session you've conducted where you have recorded a number of unidentified clients, you should record a community score for the majority of those sessions, so at least half of them. So here are all of the resources that I've gone through today. On the left, we have the documents that we in DCJ have developed. So the first resource, What is Community Score, goes through the methods and the steps that I took you through today. So please download that document and work your way through it. The Outcomes Matrix is also there, so you can download that resource. I can guarantee that it will come in very handy when it's time for you to start figuring out what outcomes you're going to measure and how you're going to measure them. And we have heard from lots of organizations that they have found it really useful to work through that process and to use that document to do so. And then on the right are all of the resources DSS have developed, including task cards and learning modules to help you actually enter the community score into the web-based platform. And as always, here are all of the different places you can go for help if you need it. If you need support figuring out how to use community score, when to use community score, what outcomes you're working towards, if you need support developing a survey instrument, please contact TEI. So you can see the TEI inbox, the email address on the screen there. You're more than welcome to come to us with any questions and ask us for any help regarding using community score. When it comes to actually entering your community score into the web-based platform or recording that information for your bulk upload or your system-to-system transfer, that's when you should go to the DSS helpline. They can help you navigate the platform, or if you're having any technical difficulties using the platform. So that's it for today, everyone. Thanks so much. I will see you in the next webinar.